Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. And today we've got a real great treat for you. The lovely Gayle Swift. Gayle's an adoptive mum of two grown-up kids.
Yes.
You were saying that one is just doing her doctorate. Wow.
Yes.
Fantastic. That's great news. That's great news. I gave up after my bachelor's. I didn't go for the doctorate. University wasn't for me, but it's great to hear that it's one for her. And you are also the co-founder of Gift, and you're a coach too. So can you give us a little bit more background on and fill in a bit more details on that, Gayle, please?
On Gift or on myself?
Both, please.
Okay. Yeah. GIFT stands for Growing Intentional Families Together, which is a company. We provide coaching to adoptive families or prospective adoptive families before, during, or after adoption. It's, as you know, coaching is different from counseling. We think we serve a very important purpose in being that neutral sounding board for people. And we were founded out of a motivation to provide a resource to parents that we wished we had when we were raising our kids back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Yeah, fantastic. So before we started, Gayle, you were saying that there's been obviously huge changes in the adoption landscape since I was adopted. There's been huge changes in the last 50 years and even in the last 20 years, and that we're seeing this growing trend towards open adoption, and it's seen by many as the panacea. And you were expressing that the fact that it may be easier in some senses, but it's still not easy. It still can be messy. And I thought that's a great jumping off point for our conversation. So why do you say that? Why do you think that people think that open adoption is a panacea?
Well, I think they believe that because the child knows and can see their biological family, their birth mother or father, maybe extended family, that removes all of the trauma. But in fact, they still experience the effects of the primal wound. They still experience the separation from their family of origin. They don't have that genetic mirroring in their own family of experience where they're being raised. They may be very loved, very secure in many ways, but they still have questions and grief. And the loss in adoption is a very ambiguous loss. So they're both in connection with their birth family and separated from their birth family. They're both loved and cared for by their adoptive family, and yet not biologically related to their adoptive family. And those are kind of amorphous losses that are hard to cope with. And there's no way to bookend a beginning and an end. It's ongoing, and it kind of spirals throughout their life. And as an adoptive parent, you will need to be able to support your kids at every age in dealing with the challenges and grief of adoption. In the beginning, when they're little and they see this extra person that's in their life, and you hear that's your birth mother. Little ones don't really quite understand what that means. It's not until they get older that they really appreciate what it means that the person to whom you're genetically related and whose body you grew is not parenting you either by choice or by a result of a termination by authorities. And that's never easy. So that pain's never going to go away. You might be more aware of it. You don't have the anonymity, the questions. Like when my kids were little, I can remember they would scan crowds, and if my son is 6'6", so he was always a big kid.
Wow.
He'd be looking for a tall blonde lady in the crowd. He'd ask his gym teacher, "Is that my birth mother?" Well, kids raised in open adoption don't have that question, but they have other questions. And to kind of relate it to another contemporary experience with which most people are familiar, we all know divorced families. We've all seen how when kids move from one house to the other parent's house, there's that agitation, that sense of goodbye, that sense of loss, then the sense of reunion. And yes, they want both parents in their life, but that transition isn't easy.
Yeah.
It's hard.
It's hard. So it strikes me, the word you use was ambiguity and ambiguous loss. What strikes me is that the questions are different, and the questions for a closed the questions running through the adoptee's mind are going to be different from a closed option, but they're still going to be there. And there's also a sense that it's clearer to us, and I'm saying us as in adoptive parents, the situation seems clearer to us, but are we applying our clarity? Are we expecting our kids to have the clarity that we do? Is that one of the things that's slightly off? We're thinking.
I think too, Simon, as an adoptive parent, with our entire being, we want to be enough for our kids. We want to be what they need. So we want to see the pretty picture. We want to believe everything's okay. We want to think that if I'm a good person and I can support and engage in a healthy, open adoption arrangement, that it will be good enough for our kids. And there will always be, I believe, an undercurrent of the adoptive parent watching the interactions between their child and the biological parent and wondering what's going on there. Truth be told, there's insecurity on the part of all adoptive parents wondering, am I good enough? Will my child fully attach? At some point, will they choose their birth family over our family? Now, these aren't rational necessarily. They're just human, right? So there's an undercurrent of competition. And I think you talk about being conscious and aware. We need to be aware of those little niggling factors that can undermine our relationship, because kids have great radar about the emotions that are going on. So when the birth mom might come to visit, they're going to key into how happy and how comfortable are my adoptive mom and dad being about this. Is it okay for me to be excited when I see my birth mom? There's all these dynamics, much of which is not necessarily conscious. I think adoptees have amazing ability to take the measure of a moment. They've got radar about it. It's kind of a survival mechanism. Who do I need to be? What do I need to do in order to make this moment and this relationship work? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. It does. And I hear adult adoptees grumbling about that. And it's like, well, we've tuned empathy is really important, right? So we have the show here in the UK called University Challenge, and these people are real egghead, nerdy type people, and they know, I can watch the show for half an hour, and as I say, I gave up after my bachelor's degree, so I'm in the middle, I guess, or intellectually in the UK, but they get quizzed on all sorts of stuff, from classical music to classical literature, all sorts of different. And I might get I don't know how many questions there are in that half hour. Let's say there's 150. I might get 2 right out of those 150. But most of those people that sit on that show who know everything, I wouldn't want to hire any of those people, right? I wouldn't want to be stuck on a train down to London, which is 2 hours. I wouldn't want to be stuck on a flight over to New York, which it'd take me 7 hours, and definitely want to be flying to LA for 11 hours sat next to these things. You know, they know everything, and yet they have no empathy. They're robots. You know, they're robots. They seem to have very little empathy, and you know, empathy and understanding others is the key to all foundations. And so, if we've developed that, you know, we've developed a sense of whether we can be safe with somebody or not. You know, that's clearly a big thing now, and obviously the next thing is that we can be quick. The story is, you know, that we can be quick. We were talking to this earlier before we started recording about we can be quick to feel rejection.
Yes.
That's kind of what many people will say about adoptees. Totally. And at the same time, as I said that, I can see that sometimes I cause offense, right? And I have no intention to do that. Sure. And sometimes I don't. Sometimes I cause offense without, unintentionally, and sometimes I think I've caused offense and I haven't at all. So it's kind of a lot more complicated than that. I think, you know, the shrinks. You know, you said rational. I think in a conversation like we're having, and in our society, we're looking for the rational all the time, and what sounds rational, oh yeah, well, that kind of makes sense. It's not always the truth, is it?
Well, and I think too, we talk about their ability to key in to everything that's going on, the monitoring. This is both an amazing survival skill. It's a blessing, unless they feel like they have to do it rather than it's being a choice. Empathy, attunement, Dr. Dan Siegel says, attunement is essential to human survival. Without it, we don't feel alive, we don't feel safe, we don't feel secure. And in Growing Intentional Families Together, we work with a parenting concept called adoption attunement, which is basically transcending adoption competence. You know, because you're talking about the academic level, that's knowing the facts of adoption and what adopted kids need. Adoption attunement is about being there on every level, tuning in to their emotions, to your emotions, to understanding the complexities behind grief and separation, to recognizing the need for our kids to know and have connection to their roots, to recognizing that adoptive parenting is a bit different from bio-parenting because our kids have some special needs as a result of being separated from their families. And if we're not educated on how to respond to those special needs, our kids suffer. And I think a lot of people, particularly here in the States, with there's so much private adoption, this educational element is missing. And they think, I'll just love my child. Love will take care of it all. You can love your child beyond belief, but you still have to know what you're doing to meet an adopted child's needs.
Yeah, I do think it's very strange the extent to which post-adoption is, you know, has a bit part. It's a real bit player. I mean, if you like people saying the stuff that they're doing, and it seems to me tiny. It seems to be tiny, and
Can I ask you to clarify that? Do you mean that it doesn't get enough attention, or you think it's insignificant?
I feel that it doesn't get enough attention. I feel it is insignificant. And it's interesting, like, because I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, and because I don't know if you know this, but no money changes hands in the UK for adoption.
I did know that, and I think that's what is much better in your country.
Yeah. And yeah, so what I was thinking was, because the money is in the adoption, not the post-adoption, you know, the attention goes where the money is, right? So that seemed to me yesterday afternoon. I thought, all right, okay, I've spotted something there. But then, as I was thinking about, you know, my new little idea from yesterday, as we were speaking, I was thinking, well, post-adoption in the UK is negligible, and there's no money in the adoption, so it's not a money thing. It's not to do with money. It's to do with perhaps well, maybe it's catching up. Maybe it's, you know, before we started recording, you talked about the cultural. You talked about a cultural presupposition that adoption is benign, and that's largely changed. But maybe the systems have yet to catch up with it. Maybe that's why, I don't know, but and I don't know why I'm pontificating on this when you're far more expert than this on me. So why do you think that is? Why do you think post-adoption gets so little focus, time, money?
Part is wishful thinking. Part is, part is a lot of times the bigger issues don't show up until kids are 7 or 8 and begin to have the intellectual ability to understand the ramifications of what it really means that you were placed for adoption. You know, I think it's human nature to kind of put our heads in the sand and not admit that there's a problem, because when we name the problem, it becomes real. And if we don't name the problem, or we keep the wool over our eyes and kind of hope it's a maturing thing that's going to go away, then we can all believe in the fairy tale that this adoption was happily ever after. I think another part of it is, as adoptive parents, we want to be everything our kids need. We love these kids. We work so hard to be able to qualify to be their parents. We have to move our awareness not to finally we're parents, but how can I be the parent this child needs? Because the skills of an adopted parent, by nature of the circumstance, so early maternal child separation, by nature, you need a different set of skills. You need to play detective about what's going on with your child, because, as you know, the language of kids speak through behavior. They don't have the language skills, the emotional words to describe what they're feeling. A lot of times it's not even in their awareness. But when we see them acting out after their birth mom's visit is over, we may think, God, we arranged that visit. We made this trip all the way to another state or another county. You know, we did our best to make sure it was a great day. And now they're being a pain in the butt. If we can step back with our adoption attuned eyes and ears and realize this is stress, this is emotional overwhelm, this is hard to say goodbye, you know, and kind of tune into what their behavior is telling us. We have empathy, we have rapport, and we need to step away from our emotional reaction. Maybe later we can say, I was so frustrated when Mike wasn't happy. We arranged this great day. Wouldn't you think he'd be grateful? Well, You know, if Mike was an adult, maybe he'd be grateful, but as a kid, he doesn't have that capability. So we have to have that awareness about our own contribution to the conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. So you said the key question was, how can I be the parent this children needs me to be?
Mm-hmm.
So what are the clearly this is a huge subject. What are the threads of that, or the highlights of that? Or, if you've maybe listened to any other episodes, I normally ask the guests, what do thriving adoptees mean to you? And the guest says X, Y, and Z. And I say, so what do you think helps that happen? So on a big point, from a helicopter view, what are the threads of that, of the answers to that question? How can I be the parent this child needs me to be?
One, we have to admit to ourselves that adoptive parenting is in fact different from bioparenting. That's the first step. We need to become familiar with the 7 core issues of adoption. There are lots of people that adopt here in the United States that have never heard of the 7 core issues of adoption. To me, that is a big hole in their education and preparation, because if they did, they'd be capable of being much more adoption competent parents to their kids. In AQ, adoption attunement, which is what we talk about, that adoptive parents have a responsibility to become familiar with the 7 core issues of adoption, that we have good boundaries. Our child's story is their story. Our neighbors should not know the facts of a kid's life and story before they arrived in your family, ever, before your child does. It's their business if they want to share it with somebody. So a lot of times, Simon, you adopt a child and you are so excited. Your dream has come true. Not necessarily a dream for the adoptee, but your dream has come true. And people will say, what do you know about his birth mother? Was she old? Oh, are you worried? Did she use drugs? And people have verbal diarrhea, and they spout the kid's entire story to anybody that asks. And that's so unhealthy, because you can't take back that information. It's like posting on the internet. There's no way to get back every copy of your conversation. Privacy, good boundaries, empathy, understanding that your adopted child has different DNA than you do, and therefore you have to embrace the idea that they need to become the child their DNA has prepared them to be. So maybe for the past 10 generations in your family, everybody has been an athlete, and it's rah, 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 let's play a sport every season. But if this child's DNA comes from 10 generations of musicians or dancers or artists, they may have very little in common with you. Maybe you're real outdoors people and your child is a very cerebral person. You have to embrace the person they genuinely are. They're not clay that you can make into the embodiment of your fantasy child. That's cruel.
Yeah. And I'm laughing. I'm laughing inside because I've just come back from the swimming pool, and my dad was a keen swimmer, and he taught me to swim. So I have followed that kind of. I followed that. I mean my dad. I don't mean my biological dad. So I guess there must be, but I completely get the point, and also I completely see there's going to be the exceptions that prove the rule.
Well, and for sure, and there's also, you can encourage them to enjoy the things you like. And then you have to flip the coin and encourage yourself to enjoy the things they like.
Yeah.
Right? Right? So embrace the diversity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, that's about rapport, empathy, admitting the truth. Truth seeking is a holy endeavor.
Yeah.
Let's not play a fantasy game of role playing. Let's be genuine.
Yeah. So, what I'm just looking back over my, I'm looking back over the notes, and you've talked a lot about shades of grey and ambiguity and amorphous. I guess one of the other key things then, skills, key skills, is being kind of flexible, kind of curious,
Mm-hmm.
and going with the flow, and being, what do people call this? Able to handle uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
What are the skills, kind of, if we're focusing in on our own skills as adoptive parents, and I'm obviously, most of the listeners will know I'm not an adoptive parent, but I'm just playing along with this, as you are, and the people listening are. So what would you say are those skills to develop and hone as an adoptive parent?
You nail it. Flexibility, empathy, rapport, curiosity, and also altering your expectations. You can't have expectations about who your kid is going to be. You need to be that detective that looks at this beautiful child and said, what are your gifts? What are your aptitudes? What are your interests? And really cultivate that with joy, not resent it. Don't resent the fact he's not an athlete. Embrace the fact he's not an athlete. That gives your family a robust diversity. And, a bouquet of roses is lovely, but a bouquet of 10 or 20 different flowers is beyond belief, right?
Yeah. So before we started, the flexibility and the expectations go kind of hand in hand for me. So a lack of expectations.
Absolutely. And the other thing is
the foundation of flexibility. It's going with the flow. Yeah.
Recognizing that talking about adoption is never a once and done conversation. It's planting seeds throughout the day, the week, the month, the years, so that kids know conversations about adoption are welcome. If every time your child raises a question about their origins, mom starts to tear up and hunch down and, oh, we don't talk about that. You don't have to say it in words. You can say it with body posture and your reaction, and kids will learn early on that's not a welcome subject. I'm not allowed to bring that up. It can be a totally nonverbal communication, but the message is sent surely. You need to be, and I think whenever we're inviting conversations about adoption with our kids, if you say to Johnny, hey, would you like to talk about your birth mother today? Hello, he's going to say, no, mom, right? It's just totally out of context. But if while you're out in the garden and you see he's really got a green thumb and yours is pretty black, you might drop a conversation. See, I wonder if either of your birth parents was good at gardening, and then just leave it at that. If they pick it up, great. And if not, you've conveyed the message to your child. It's okay for him to think about his birth parents, and B, it's okay to let you know about that. And you're not offended by his thinking about it or wanting to talk about it. It's a point of shared interest. You're interested because it's important to your kid.
Yeah. So before we started recording, we were talking about my insecurity, right? And I'm intrigued about how you see that, how you see that as a, I don't know, the only word that can come to mind, the first word that comes to my mind in terms of a verb, like handling insecurity, and I'm sure that's not the, that's not the right way to phrase the question, but do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? When, how do you advise clients, or how do you, when you're coaching them, or how do you handle your kid's own insecurity when it raises its head? What are your thoughts on insecurity?
So first of all, I'd say it's well documented that adoptees tend to have a soft spot for rejection. It's considered one of the 7 core issues of adoption, according to research. I'm not the researcher, that's what the research says. As an adoptive parent, in the back of your mind, you accept that fact. Adoptees tend to be a little bit sensitive about anything that smacks of rejection. So as you want to help your kids develop resiliency, right? So as they're growing up, if they kind of have an over-the-top reaction about Johnny won't play with me, you don't say, oh, that's because you're adopted, right? But you help him say, well, what do you think Johnny's help him to develop social skills about how to navigate relationships. And then in the back of your mind, you notice that, you play detective. Is what other times is he easily triggered? And you help him build strengths and awareness and say, do you notice that sometimes it really bothers you if someone looks at you a little funny? What do you think's going on there? You don't make them right or wrong or embarrassed. It's just from a point of curiosity. Let's learn together what's going on.
Yeah. One of the questions I often ask adoptive parents on this, around this subject and on the communication part, is what does our own what does our own vulnerability, as in admitting, sharing stories of our own foibles or insecurities, what role does that play? And the reason that I ask that is because I found that doing work with kids, I'm talking elementary school kids, I found that to be very empowering. As a, I'm kind of coming. It was in a school setting, right? And I was coming in as a kind of almost like an authority, not an authority figure, but coachy, kind of inspirational, helpful guy, but nevertheless an adult. And I found myself sharing a story on the back of a conversation that one of the kids mentioned about being bullied. I found myself sharing a story from my own childhood about being bullied and how that made me fail. And that connected like nothing else that Absolutely. I was sharing it, I was sharing it in a kind of like a straightforward adult way, but hopefully not oversharing it. I'm sure that I did it on many occasions afterwards because I knew that it built empathy and it built rapport. And no teacher ever told me off, and teachers do have a habit of telling people off if they think that they're wrong. So I'm assuming that that there was nothing wrong in the way I did it. But what role does our own vulnerabilities, expressing our own vulnerabilities, especially perhaps when we were going through a similar situation as our child, or whether we were same age. What role does that have?
One, I think sharing stories is universally beneficial. Sharing our own personal stories that show that we survived and had resilience is encouraging for them. It also provides them a perspective that I think kids tend to see their parents almost as like superheroes, gods, with no flaws. Everything's easy for mom and dad. So I think it humanizes parents. In my own coaching practice, I encourage parents, this may sound a little silly, but when you're at home and as an adult, you're struggling with a task and you've got a little one in the background to play an audio channel. This book is so hard for me to read, but it's important for me to do it for my job. So Johnny hears it. You're not saying, Johnny, you have to do your schoolwork even when it's hard, but periodically let them eavesdrop on your own interior conversations, because that models skills and behaviors that otherwise they might never, ever notice.
Yeah. And I think that's so powerful. And my dad used to encourage me to do that when I was driving, when he was teaching me to drive. And whenever I go anywhere near this subject, I always jump in and say, and I wish it had been better. I wish this tactic could have worked, but at least he knew what was going on in my head, right? Because I'm not a particularly good driver. But yeah, he used to say, like, well, just tell me what's going on, because otherwise he had no clue, right? He didn't know how aware I was of that bus about to pull out, whatever, until he saw my foot go for the brake. So yeah, I love that eavesdropping in, and I also think that we all want to feel that our feelings are normal.
Oh gosh, yes.
And so if instead of telling our kid to buck their ideas up, then when they're struggling, we share a story of how we struggled with that, and they're going, oh right, it's okay. Mm-hmm. It's okay to struggle, and there's an honesty there as well. I once heard a coach of mine, a mentor of mine, talking about his son wanting to be. It was an American sport. I think it was baseball, and his kid sucked at baseball because he was a little kid, and so he went out. He went out into the yard playing baseball, and he kind of he was honest with his son, and about his son's abilities, and his son was crestfallen. He's real down in the dumps. But as soon as he'd said, yeah, you're not great at this yet.
I love that. The power of yet is amazing.
It is. I mean, that growth mindset. I mean, I've mentioned it on a couple of the podcasts. She took about 10 hours to say that yet is where it's at.
I think a lot of parents miss that, Simon.
Yeah.
They deliver the bad news, make it a permanent state of affairs rather than a current state of affairs.
Yeah, it's not where you are now, it's where you want to be. Mm-hmm. And then we're moving forward and we're practicing, and then there's all those stories about the 10,000 hours and stuff like that. And yes, maybe in some occasions, sometimes we take stuff to a duck to water. It doesn't need us 10,000 hours. Sometimes we do need to we do need to practice. So yeah, the power of yet, and I'm thinking that our own learning curve, expressing, sharing our own learning curves with our kids has got
And
to
that life is a learning conversation that even as adults, we are still learning. I'm learning Spanish, like kids know, you never, I'm 72, I still take courses. You never overlearn the learning process.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the word curiosity earlier on in terms of skills for adoptive parents. And I often say this on the podcast, is that you're already doing this, listeners, because you're listening to the podcast.
Exactly.
You're not watching some telly at the moment. You're not listening to a sports commentary on as you drive to work. You're not, whatever it is, you're not listening to the news. You're listening to a podcast because you want to learn something new. And I've actually, because I've done some work with non-adoptive parents as well, I found them to be far more curious. The adoptive parents are far more curious. They have a sense that there may be some tough stuff ahead, and they want to be prepared for that, or they're having some struggles at the moment, and they don't want to bury their heads in the sand, and that's why hopefully they're listening to the show to get some insights from somebody that's been there both personally and professionally.
And Simon, if I could insert a caveat here, I don't mean to interrupt you, but when they seek out resources, that you should be sure they're adoption competent resources, because there are lots of professionals here in the United States that do not understand adoption, have never been trained in adoptee issues. They don't know about the 7 core issues of adoption. They don't know about ambiguous loss in adoption. And they can actually do not only not help, but in some cases do harm. So vet those professionals, make sure that they've had training in adoption.
Yeah. Where are you on the, you mentioned that, I mentioned that you're a coach. I know that you're a coach, and you mentioned it too. Where's your view in terms of accountability of, I guess responsibility is probably a better word. Adoptive parents being responsible rather than, I mean, it's not an all or nothing here, but this kind of therapist coach mix, where do you see all that playing out? How does that look to you?
From the point of view of responsibility, that's the last item in adoption. It's to our parenting philosophy. It's understanding we have a responsibility to educate ourselves on adoption complexity, and that when we seek out professionals, we ensure they have the proper credentials. There are many programs being developed in the United States nowadays for adoption competency. So ideally, you'd get one of those people that have been trained that way. But you definitely want someone that has some idea. I have a good friend who is a therapist, and she said when she was being trained, I'm guessing maybe 20 years ago, they had 40 minutes in their 3 years of her training, 40 minutes on adoption. Another therapist friend of mine said she had 0. So if they don't understand the primal wound, they just think this kid is being obnoxious, that family's not getting help. That child is being damaged.
Yeah.
So that's why you have a responsibility to get help, to get good help, to get educated, because you love this child. And as a consequence, better off.
Yeah. So I think it's about becoming an informed consumer or purchaser of services. That the more we know ourselves, the better we can, the better questions that we can ask,
Absolutely.
different providers. And I would jump in on that as well, is from my own experience, would be about trusting your gut as well. So make the decision, look at the decision both from what your gut says about the person and from the hard stuff in terms of the qualification. I mean, I wouldn't be interviewing if I was to put what you said together and what I said together. I wouldn't be interviewing anybody that wasn't adoption competent and couldn't answer that question clearly and succinctly. I do find some therapists great with words. You know, they talk the talk. So yeah, we I don't know what advice have you got around that area?
Well, one question I'd be sure to ask is, what role do you think my child adoption is playing in our family dynamic? Because maybe you're fine, and I'd say find a different therapist.
Okay. So I'm conscious of time here, Gayle. Is there a question that I've not asked that you'd love to share something on?
I think we must ask ourselves to be strong enough to face the truth in every circumstance of our family, about ourselves, about our kids' needs. And when open adoption, even here in the States, they're not legally enforceable contracts. I think we have a moral obligation to do what it takes to make open adoption work. And let's face it, it's going to be hard. You've got all of these adults with competing emotions. Each of them are wounded by the loss that's inherent in adoption. The birth mother grieves the loss of her child. The child grieves the loss of his ancestry. The adoptive parent grieves the fact that they couldn't carry this child in their body. So we're all wounded. Let's admit that and address our needs, get educated, get prepared, and do the work.
Yeah. So listeners, I'd encourage you to check out the show notes and check out what Gayle's doing on this coaching and gift. She's I was delighted to be on. They've got a podcast too. Gift have got a podcast too, and I was delighted to. They were one of the first. You and your colleagues were one of the first to have me on. So I was delighted to be a part of that. So check out their podcast. Check out, as always, in the show notes, there's links to the guests' socials and their organizations' website. Check out what they're doing, and thank you very much for coming on, Gayle.
One quick thing I'd like to add. A lot of times opening conversations about adoption within our families isn't always easy. So my daughter and I, she's an adoptee, have written 2 children's books. They're award-winning. I'd love for people to check those out. And in terms of the role of the church here in our country, the church has been a big proponent of adoption. And we think that there's need for some reimagining of the role of the way that they support and advocate for adoption. So one of my colleagues at Growing Intentional Families and I co-authored a book called Reimagining Adoption. And it's also award-winning. And I don't say that to build myself up, but to say we're trying to improve the conversation and the experience of adoptive families. And we believe these 3 books help to do that.
Okay, so in the show notes, listeners, there'll be a link to Gayle's own site and the gift site, so you can check out all the books off there. And once again, Gayle, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And listeners, thank you for listening. You've stayed with us to the end, so we must have been doing something right. So good on you, Gayle.
I enjoyed it very much, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you. See you again. Speak to you again very soon.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.